We are concerned not merely with the technical problem of securing and maintaining peace, but also with the important task of education and enlightenment.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. This is Grant Cameron, and I have a super special guest. I'm actually kind of nervous to do the guest tonight. My guest is Riz Virk, who is going to be a speaker at Contact in the Desert. I'm also speaking at Contact in the Desert. I'll be speaking on contact modalities, and my workshop will be on portals and the latest on what the government may have in way of portals. I was lucky enough, Victoria, who runs Contact in the Desert, said to me that because I had a podcast, I could interview anybody I wanted from the speakers. This is one of the ones I chose. Before I get to Riz, I'd like to sort of introduce my avatar that is helping me out today on stage here. She's joined me on tonight's stage play, and that's Annie Hanley. And how you doing, Annie?
Well, Sinead Willihan, otherwise known as Anya Hanley, but let's go with Sinead Willihan tonight.
Oh, you're on Sinead tonight.
Okay. Doing very well. Thank you, Grant. And as always, it's great to be here. And I'm very much looking forward to learning from Riz.
Yeah, because we're going to do simulation. Are we living in a simulation? And we've discussed this probably quite a few times. And so you're going to be Sinead tonight, and it's the old idea. You are not the actor on the stage. You are just playing an actor on a stage. Big difference. So my guest today is Riz, and he is giving his presentation at the Contact in the Desert. His book is called The Simulation Hypotheses. An MIT computer scientist shows why AI, quantum physics, and Eastern mystics all agree that we are in a video game. So Riz is a successful entrepreneur, MIT computer-trained scientist, video game designer, best-selling author, and independent film producer. This I didn't know. Riz has produced many indie films and once had more than 70 million views, which is unbelievable. His lecture at Contact in the Desert, and the Contact in the Desert, if you've never been there on the ground, it is basically the Super Bowl of weird paranormal stuff. It is like, I don't know, it's a 3 or 4 star hotel, and you just go like, you just cannot believe how many people are there. There's multiple events going on at the same time. It is unbelievable. So Riz is going to be speaking there. His lecture is going to be on the simulation hypotheses, living in the matrix, and unexplained phenomena. And then he's going to be on 2 panels, which I am definitely going to tune into. The one panel is spirituality, consciousness, new human panel. And the other panel that he's going to be on is the new description of reality panel. And that's basically a lot of the podcasts that we're doing is consciousness, and it's the nature of reality. And so I'm very honored to have Riz join us tonight. How are you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Yeah, I listened to a lot of your interviews and was amazed at the stuff you brought up. Can we go maybe through your background to describe how you got into this little rabbit hole that we're all in here?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I studied computer science many years ago and was working in enterprise software, which has nothing to do with any of this stuff. But about a decade ago, I moved to Silicon Valley and started working in the video game industry, and was on the founding team of a couple successful video game companies, including one. We had a game called Tap Fish that was downloaded over 30 million times, and we ended up selling that to a big Japanese company. And as I learned about how we made video games, I had an interest in consciousness, all along, and in meditation. And it was after that I had invested in a virtual reality company, and I went into their office and I was playing this virtual reality ping pong game that they were building. And so I had the VR headset on, and I had the controller in my hand, and it looked to me like there was a real ping pong table in front of me, and there was even an opponent on the other side. And as I played the game, it was so realistic that I forgot that it was all virtual. So much so that at the end of the game, I put the paddle down on the table and tried to lean against the table. And of course, the controller fell to the floor and I almost fell over. And that's when I realized, oh my God, our technology is getting to the point where we will be able to we will not be able to distinguish between what is real and what is virtual. And so I started to think about how the technology would evolve. And I lay out 10 stages of technology development in my book for getting to what I call the simulation point, which is the point at which we can create something like the Matrix, which, as you'll remember from the movie, Neo, Keanu Reeves' character, he had been living his entire life in the Matrix and could not distinguish that that wasn't reality. So that's really what got me started, was looking at it from a technology point of view. But then, of course, I got into the more philosophical aspects of it. And as I started to look into the quantum physics side of it, I realized that being in a simulation was more consistent with some of the weird findings of quantum physics than any other explanation we have at the moment. And also that maybe all the religions have been telling us this all along, that what we see around us is not the real world. And so I ended up writing the book to really pull together these different threads of simulation and reality.
Now, I spent 37 years at a university, not teaching, but I did deal with academics all the time, starting when I was very young as a bartender. So I got to talk to them and have them sort of challenge me. What was the reaction? Like, yours is not as far out as like sort of ghosts, UFOs, paranormal stuff. But what was the reaction? Because you came from MIT and Stanford. What was the reaction from the academia in terms of the simulation, and how long has the simulation theory been around? Is there an opening in the academic community to weird ideas and weird things that we might be talking about now?
Well, yeah, I mean, there is an opening in terms of simulation theory, at least. One of the aspects of simulation theory that I really like is it provides a bridge between the mystical, paranormal, and the scientific, because it provides a technological explanation for things. Now, it was, I think, in 2003 that a professor at Oxford named Nick Bostrom released a paper called "Are You Living in a Computer Simulation?" And, he went through the odds of whether we could be in a simulation or not. And, his argument basically said that if there was any civilization in the galaxy or the universe that got to what I call the simulation point, then they wouldn't create just one simulation, they would create lots of simulations. I mean, literally all it takes is booting up another process on a server, right? So you could literally have billions of simulations with trillions of beings. And so he came up with a statistical argument that said that if there are way more simulated beings than physical beings, you as a being and me as a being are more likely to be a simulated being, just using simple probability. And so that paper actually opened up this topic in academia. I think before that it was considered science fiction, right? The Matrix came out in 99. But because of that paper, at least within the philosophical world, within academia, they were willing to talk about it. And then as our technology improved and our rendering of video games, computer scientists started to talk about it. And then, Elon Musk famously said in 2016 that 40 years ago all we had was Pong, which, if you remember, was the old Atari game, arcade game that was just two squares and a dot that went back and forth, right? So that, in a way, that was the predecessor to the virtual reality ping pong game that I was playing 40, 50 years later. In fact, I think it was 2016 when I was playing the game, so it's the same year that Musk said this. And so he said, if you assume any rate of improvement at all, given where video games are today, then we will get to a point where we will be unable to distinguish between video games and reality. And so between those two individuals in particular, I think really opened up the discussion within both Silicon Valley and in academia. Now, when I wrote the book, I had been involved in a program at the MIT Game Lab, which studies video games. And of course, there were people, I think, in academia were more than willing to discuss it, though they weren't necessarily, willing to take a public stance on whether they thought we were in a simulation or not. I think it's more seen as this is a fun topic we can talk about, as opposed to a serious topic that physicists, are willing to say this is a real possibility. In fact, most physicists still believe that there's a material world, even though their own discipline is telling them that may not be the case.
Yeah, and I'm going to send it to Sinead right away. Is there a difference, I guess, depending who you're talking to? Like, in academia, people always think that because got a PhD, you know everything about everything, and people are very specialized. So so the computer people are into it, the physics people aren't. Is there any other sort of groups that are taking positions or are involved, or they really don't really care? It's not really in their sort of field.
Well, I think within philosophy, people are pretty open to it. Within neuroscience, people are certainly open to the idea that, the real world as we know it is just a set of electrical signals. If you remember from the Matrix, right, there was a quote from Morpheus, who was named after the Greek god of dreams, said, "What is real? It is a series of electrical signals into your brain." And so I think there's a group of people, within academia, within neuroscience and other places, for example, Donald Hoffman at the University of California, Irvine, came out with a book called The Case Against Reality, who take the more subjective view. Now, when I talk about the simulation hypothesis, I like to make a distinction, because it turns out that one of these is easier for academics to get into than the other. And so the two versions I talk about are the NPC version and the RPG version. And so the NPC version of the simulation hypothesis is the non-player characters. So these are like the AI in the video games. So if you're, playing World of Warcraft and you chop the head off an orc or a dragon, those are not people playing those characters. Those are just AI characters in the simulated world. And so, but the other version, the RPG version, which I think is actually the more interesting version, is we exist outside of the video game and we play avatars inside the video game. So now you'll notice these two are not mutually exclusive. In a game like World of Warcraft or League of Legends, you will have both. You'll have PCs, player characters, and NPCs, non-player characters, and they'll be mingling in a multiplayer game. And so, within academia, the idea that we could all be NPCs has actually caught on, and people are willing to discuss it because they're seeing that the number of computations, we can do with computers is rivaling the number of computations that can be done in the brain. And so, many people think we're only decades away from achieving artificial general intelligence. And so who's to say we aren't AI? So that version, they're pretty open to. The RPG version, which is closer to, I think, what a lot of people in the religious traditions talk about, we exist outside of the game. That one's a little bit harder for anybody in the hard sciences or technology world to talk about, although people in the religious world are very open to talking about that idea.
Okay, Sinead?
Thank you, Grant. Riz, first of all, I love that you're mentioning the Matrix, because I'm also a movie person. Grant is not, so you're kind of helping me prod him a little closer towards actually watching the Matrix, Grant. Which is
he hasn't seen the Matrix yet?
He's never seen it. It's just shocking. He's never seen it. So I'm going to.
Well, this year, sorry to interrupt, but this year there's actually 4 simulation-related movies that are out. There was a documentary called A Glitch in the Matrix. There was a movie with Salma Hayek called Bliss. There's one with Ryan Reynolds called Free Guy, where he plays an NPC. And then The Matrix 4 is coming out in December. So this is the year to watch Matrix movies.
I always have the problem that I very rarely watch fiction, because I want people to know that if I tell you a story, I didn't get it from a movie. I actually experienced it or something like that. So that's my catch. But it's true, I have not watched The Matrix. I know a lot about it, but I have not watched it. So go ahead, Sinead.
Love it. You're going to absolutely love it. It's a fantastic film. But Riz, here's my question for you. So my introduction to this concept that you are an expert in, I wasn't thinking of it as being the way you're describing it right now. This is several years ago, but I had read this really interesting article about training for athletes, and how there was this new type of training methodology that was being used, where athletes were basically hooked up to some kind of machine. They wouldn't be running around a track or jumping or doing whatever they'd usually be doing outdoors. They would be in place on let's say a treadmill indoors, connected to a computerized machine, and then they would be visualizing their training. So their trainer would be there with them. Their trainer would be telling them, okay, now you're going to be doing this, now you're going to be doing that, such as lifting weights, or you're going to run 10K or whatever it was. But they wouldn't actually be doing that. They would be moving on a treadmill, let's say, but they wouldn't actually be lifting the weights or running the 10K. So the trainer and the researchers who were there involved in this project were saying to them, you have to visualize this. And what was fascinating to me was that these were professional athletes, right? So their bodies are used to doing things a certain way, and their minds are used to thinking a certain way, because it's such a disciplined profession. But they were simply visualizing this, and the same parts of their brains were lighting up that would light up if they were actually doing the activity. And also their muscles were responding in a way that they would if they were normally doing the activity. So I thought that was fascinating. I thought, like, that is such a, to me, a clear example of the overlap between mind and, you know, perception, but also there's machines, and it's not exactly reality, but it also is. So what could you say about that in terms of, you know, how the material brain and the body, the muscles respond to you know, entering into another kind of way of perceiving or another kind of reality, kind of what you were saying about how you drop the controller, you're trying to open this gate or something and you drop the controller, you're so convinced you were in this other place. So
Yeah.
how does that play into the work that you're doing?
Yeah, well, you know, it definitely plays in because within the video game world, there have been studies done where they find that if a virtual character smiles at you, you know, you have a physiological reaction very similar to if a person were to smile at you in the physical world. And so you start to see this overlap between the reactions that we have and the types of stimuli that there might be. And so within the virtual reality world, there are companies that are started which are using VR to help you relax for meditation, or for example, or to de-stress. When I was at MIT, we had a company come through where a guy actually trained professional athletes, and he would measure their stress, and they were creating these little environments in VR. So you could put it on and you could measure the amount of stress, you know, using various biofeedback measurements, etc. And then it turns out there's actually companies now that are using virtual reality to help people overcome anxiety and phobias. So where, you know, if you're afraid of spiders, well, or snakes, you're not going to go, you know, get an actual snake. But turns out in virtual reality, you can have a snake in there and your body reacts in a similar way. So it's possible to condition the person to get over their anxiety. And so there's a lot of studies around this that are still being done. I'd say it's a relatively new area, but it's very true. And if you've ever been inside a virtual reality game, like I was in another one where I was in a cave complex on a path with a steep fall to my right, and I didn't want to move my leg to the right because it felt like I would actually fall over, which of course I wouldn't because I was just in a virtual reality room. So, you know, I think we're learning more about how the brain works through this type of technology. And then in my book, you know, one of the stages that I talk about to get to Matrix-like video games is actually brain-computer interfaces, right? So this is a new area where you would interface the computer code and send the signals directly into your brain and read your responses right out of the brain. Now, this is still in its infancy. Elon Musk comes up again because he has a company called Neuralink where they had a monkey playing video games, and they showed that he was able to control it with his mind because of that they were able to measure the signals, the electrical signals that were coming out. And so there's ways to do it using electrical signals in the brain. There's ways to measure electrical signals in the arm, etc. And so brain-computer interfaces is a pretty fascinating area in and of itself. And before we would really build something fully like the Matrix, we would need to have that. And of course, then the resolution is the resolution of the brain, which people have said is the best visualization device that's out there when we visualize internally. So yeah, I think there's a lot of overlap between how we visualize things and simulation theory and virtual reality. And in fact, you know, if you look back at we were talking a little bit about Buddhism earlier, and I studied a lot about Tibetan dream yoga. And so this was one of the 6 yogas of Naropa. And it was a way for people to realize that the world is an illusion by learning to do something like a lucid dream where you would wake up inside the dream. And so, you know, it occurred to me as I was laying out all these technological stages that we would get to in a few decades or a century or so, maybe, I realized we already had all of that technology. It was already in our heads. Every night when we dream, we create the simulated world, and within it, there are characters that look like independent characters. And we forget that there's a part of us outside of that dream that is actually laying in bed. So it becomes completely immersive, and we can not only react to it, but it reacts to us. And so it's interesting that technology, to a certain extent, already exists.
Wow, that is fascinating. And actually, you're kind of making me think about how Pokemon was a huge craze. I mean, not way back when, but there was I can't remember what it was called exactly.
Pokemon Go, right? A few years ago,
Yeah,
Pokemon
people were
Go
walking
was the
around
mobile game.
outside. Yes, yes, they were
Yeah.
holding their phones and they could actually see, you know, or well, actually see the Pokemon character in front of them. And that changed everything for a lot of people in the autism community who had a great deal of social anxiety, who didn't feel like they could go outside and actually interact with the, you know, the so-called physical environment and human beings were out there with them. But using this game, they were able to go out and have conversations with people and be out in the world and feel comfortable and feel safe because they have this phone in their hand, right? They were operating through a virtual reality. So it's interesting to me because there's so much about, you know, technology is awful for us, it's taking away from our humanity, which I think is also true, you know, but there's lots of advantages to it as well. So you're highlighting a really incredible advantage that it can contribute to our vision of ourselves as human beings, but also our wellness as human beings, which I didn't really think about.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole wellness industry, with using technology, ranging from sensors, EEG sensors, et cetera. But, Pokemon Go is interesting because it was one of the first successful AR or augmented reality apps. And so the idea with AR is you put a picture over the physical world and it looks like there's a little Pokemon character or an object in the physical world. Of course, with Pokemon Go, you could only see it by looking through your phone's camera. But there's a whole slew of companies that are creating augmented reality glasses. So you put on the glasses and then you actually see physical objects in the room around you. So you might say, well, what if I decorated my house with this painting on this wall, right? So you could put on the glasses and then see the painting on the wall and see how it might look before you made a decision to, actually purchase it. And so those started off as very big glasses, just like virtual reality glasses, but they're getting smaller and smaller to the point where, we're going to have glasses soon. I don't know if well, you're a science fiction fan, so you might know Westworld, but in the latest season of Westworld, Grant may not know this, but they had these glasses. You would put on the glasses and then the person would appear in front of you to talk to you as if they were actually there, right? So we're actually pretty close to being able to do stuff like that. Pretty close means, within X years time.
So why didn't Google Glasses work out? Because that came out a few years ago, I thought.
Yeah, that was a while ago. It was been like 8 years ago. Google Glass, I think, had the problem that many technologies have, that the Apple Newton had back in the 90s, right? It was just too early. Like people weren't ready really to accept it. And also it looked like a weird a weird thing that anybody could look at you and see that you had this weird thing popping out. Whereas, the glasses are, at some point will get to the point where they're contact lenses. And so then, you could have information being displayed, which interesting. I don't know if you've ever interviewed Whitley Strieber, but he's talked about having an implant that sends out text in his eyes. I'm pretty sure he talked about this publicly. Hopefully he has. He won't be mad at me for mentioning it, but I think he has, where he would see like little text in his eyes. And that's the kind of technology, that you could see with augmented reality contact lenses, which can overlay stuff around you. So there's lots of different types of applications for the technology. But what it's doing is it's blurring the line between the physical world and the digital world. And that really is very much what the simulation hypothesis is about. And so if you look within quantum physics and you ask, well, what is matter? They can't find it, right? They keep opening it up and it's like 99% space. And the electron's not really even there. It's just a set of probabilities. And so there was a physicist named John Wheeler who, he worked with Einstein and Niels Bohr and many of the fathers of quantum physics. And, he said that physics went through 3 phases in his lifetime. In the first phase, everything was a particle. They thought everything was solid. It was an actual object. In the second phase, they thought everything was a field, like a field of probabilities. And the third phase, and he died, I think, in the 80s or 90s. I'll have to look up when he passed away. But he said he realized that everything was actually information. It was a series of yes, no questions. So the only way to really define a particle is to answer these questions. And it turns out that is pretty much what computer science is based off of. Right? All of computer science and information science is based off of the bit, which is a 0 or a 1. So it's a yes, no question. And so Wheeler came up with this famous phrase that says it from bit, which means anything that looks like an it is actually, if you really open up those Russian dolls and try to figure out what's there, is really a series of bits of information. And so I think that's the broader theme with augmented reality as well, is that we're starting to blur the line between what is a physical object and what is a digital object based on information.
Sinead wants me to go. Okay, you're talking about Wheeler. He talked about the participatory universe, and you know the debate because it's probably in your book. All this stuff about is there a physical world or is it a conscious world? Like the idea where Max Planck said nothing is behind consciousness. Wheeler says it's a participatory universe. Niels Bohr says I've studied, and he won the Nobel Prize for the atom, and he said I've studied the atom, and there is no matter as such. And I speak as an authority on science. And so where do you go in your book and looking at these ideas of consciousness versus the physical world, brain versus mind, and the idea of information? What do you say information is? Like, is consciousness the information, or what is basic information that the universe is using?
Sure. Well, that's a good question, a very big question.
Yeah.
But yeah, I spent a lot of time looking into the implications of quantum physics, and you're talking about sort of the mind versus matter debate, and I think most scientists, to a certain extent, still like to think of the universe as being physical, right? As opposed to being, whether it's a participatory universe or it's a consciousness-based universe. And so the two most popular interpretations right now are the Copenhagen interpretation, which was based on Niels Bohr, who says there's a probability wave, and when it gets observed, it collapses, to a single possibility. But until then, all the possibilities exist. There are others who didn't like that idea, including Schrodinger, who came up with the idea of Schrodinger's cat. In fact, he came up with it to say, this is ridiculous. A cat can't be both alive or dead. It has to be one or the other. But it's often used as a good way to explain this weirdness in the quantum world that, in fact, quantum physics is telling us the cat is both alive and dead. It's in a state of superposition. As they call it. So that's the technical term for that state before it collapses. Now, in recent years, another theory has caught on within physicists, which is the many worlds interpretation, right? And so that says that every time there's a decision, the cat is alive or dead, we actually we spawn off multiple worlds. So there's a universe where the cat is alive, and there's a universe where the cat is dead. And I find that like an interesting explanation as well. But if you look at both of those explanations and ask yourself, well, why does this happen? Well, we don't know, right? Physics doesn't have a good explanation. Now, going back to the first one, which the golden rule seems to be only that which is observed is actually shown. Right. And turns out that's pretty similar to what we do in video games. Right. So if you go back to video games from when I was a kid, like Pac-Man or Space Invaders, right, they were just 2D games with this very small number of pixels and bits. And you said back then, well, can you render something, a lush three-dimensional world like Fortnite or World of Warcraft or Second Life? The answer would be no. There are just too many pixels. There's no way we would be able to render all of that with the computing power that we have. Well, what happened in the intervening 30, 40 years was, one, computers got better, so we can process more information. But more importantly, we came up with an optimization techniques, right? And so with those techniques, we basically only render that which can be seen by your avatar in the game, right? So if you and I and Sinead were all in the same room inside a video game, I would only see the pixels rendered that my avatar could see. And if, Sinead was sitting behind, say, a wall, I wouldn't be able to see her avatar, but she would see only what she can see. And so it seems to me that this quantum indeterminacy is an optimization algorithm that says everything is possible until and when it needs to be rendered, which leaves us with the big question of, okay, what is doing the rendering, right? And in fact, right now we're doing the same thing. I mean, I'm talking to both of you, but the reality is I'm not really talking to you. My voice is being translated into bits, which are being sent over the wire and are being rendered on your desktop computer. And I believe Sinead is in a different location, right? So it's being rendered on her computer. So we have three different individual devices rendering what's actually happening. What we think of as a conversation of us being in the same room really is a very subjective rendering thing. And I think this is where also the simulation hypothesis overlaps with ideas of UFOs and paranormal phenomenon, right? I was talking with Jacques Vallée last year, or I think the year before that, about the simulation hypothesis. And he said that in many of his sightings, there was this unexplainable element. And sometimes they left that out of like the official reports that they gave to MUFON or to the government. And he said the unexplainable part of it was that one person might see it and the person standing next to them might not. Or that the UFO actually had to go through the walls, like even though it was a physical object with physical evidence that something landed here. Before it landed here, like in one case, he was in the Northern California with all these redwoods, and they said it came down at a 45-degree angle, and he just kind of scratched his chin and said, well, that means it would have had to go literally through the trees. And they go, yeah, but we don't want to say that because that sounds crazy.
Yeah. Well, Valet is a guy that I used to think the guy was crazy. And now I'm going like, yeah, this is, the more you look at it, the more Valet was right all along, because he never always said, I'd be very suspicious if this turned out to be ETs in spacecraft. There's something else going on here. And so I'm glad you got to talk to him, because he is I would say the #1 person in terms of maybe understanding what's actually going on.
Yeah, and understanding how strange it is too, I guess. And he's also a computer scientist, so we were talking about how this might work, and so it turns out we do this in video games all the time. Like if we were all in the same room, but my character was level 2 and yours was level 3, but let's say Sinead was level 30, we could render something on her device that could be seen by her, but we wouldn't see it. So we would say it's not there, but she'd say, oh, it's obviously there. It's right there in front of me, right? And so you can do conditional rendering based on information. So that's one of the aspects of it. The other aspect, and this is actually the subject of my new book, which will be out in September, is if you look at the multiverse theory, well, it turns out that only makes sense if you think of it as a simulated world, because there's nothing in nature where you can clone, like you can't clone a whole planet, you can't clone a whole tree in an instant, right? And so if the multiverse theory is true, you would be cloning the entire physical universe, not once, but every instant that there is a decision being made, like an observation. Well, it turns out information can be cloned very quickly. Physical objects take time to be constructed and rendered, etc. But there's usually operations in a processor which say clone all these bits very simply. Or you don't even need to clone them in some cases. You can just say go from this set of bits, just change this one bit. That's the only difference between these two. So information compression and storage and copying are like pretty fundamental ways in which we do computer science. And so, this led me to think that if there are multiple universes, they are really multiple timelines, within a rendered world. And, another person that I interviewed for my book was the wife of Philip K. Dick, the science fiction writer. And, she told me that he believed, not only that we were in a computer program reality, there's actually a pretty famous quote from him saying, we are living in a computer generated reality, and the only clue we have is when some variable is changed, some alteration in our reality occurs. And she said it came to him when he thought he went into the bathroom and he thought there was a chain there for the light to be turned on. I think this was in the 70s or 60s, but it was a light switch. And he said, something is different here. I mean, I distinctly remember coming in this bathroom so many times and pulling the light. And so he thought there was some weird little change that was being made. And he wrote this story called The Adjustment Team, which was later made into a movie called The Adjustment Bureau with Matt Damon and Emily Blunt. But it was about these guys who would come in and change things. And so over time, he began to believe this was happening not at just tiny levels, but at very big levels. Like he said, he wrote his book called The Man in the High Castle, which was a Hugo Award-winning book back in 1960 about when the Japanese and the Germans won World War II. And he said he did it not just as pure science fiction, it was from fragmentary memories of this alternate timeline. And he believed that someone had rewound the timeline and run it again. Now that sounds a lot more like a computer game and a computer simulation, than a physical universe that has only one level of reality. And so it's very possible that things like the Mandela effect are actually us remembering a different run of the same timeline. So it's like you can run a simulation again and again to see what might happen.
That would explain synchronicities as well, do you think? Sorry, Sinead.
No, that's okay. Go ahead.
No,
I think.
Yeah, synchronicities, yeah.
Yeah, synchronicities and deja vu, right, are kind of a couple of areas which I think explain. So, I mean, he thought deja vu was literally you're feeling like you're running through the same scene again because you actually are. You've actually been through it before and you don't actually remember it. I think it can explain synchronicity as well, because synchronicity seems like, two things that aren't connected logically, but they are connected from the point of view of the observer, right? And so, recently I was talking with Diana Walsh-Pasulka, who wrote American Cosmic, and she calls it a technological singularity. And that's the idea that, like, if I'm on Facebook, and we've probably all had this happen to us, where I was just shopping for something on Amazon, and I go to Facebook and I see an ad for that same thing that I was shopping for, and you're like, wait, how did it know that I was just shopping for shoes? Why is it showing me an ad for shoes, or for a trip to Italy, when I was just on a completely different website? I might have been on, in a completely different browser window. And turns out there's these thing called cookies, which are used and kept track of by the observer, and they're used by advertisers. So there's a technological reason why it's showing me this thing that coincides. But if I knew nothing about cookies, I'd say, wow, this is magic. How's this happening? And so, getting back to Jacques Vallée, Jacques believes that the universe stores information by using association. And so it's just a structure of how the universe stores that information. It doesn't store it based on A, B, C, D, E, F. It stores it based on some association. And so that's why things that are associated with each other appear at the same time, because it's actually more efficient for the universe to do it that way. So that's one possible, explanation of synchronicity, I think. Yeah.
So do you feel like the virtual reality world, I mean, you've been talking about how it's blurring the line between what's real and what isn't, what's real and what's digital. It's also coming into our lives in a very personal way, in a very real way, like kinesthetic, sensory way, in which we become completely convinced, or we can completely forget that we are not in our living room anymore, where we feel like we're actually in this other place. So do you feel like VR is also, or virtual simulated reality in whatever form, is also using association to help us compute what's going on, because it's giving us familiar scenarios, right? It's using things that we already have some knowledge of, or some exposure to, or some familiarity with, or our senses have some memory of. And these are the worlds that we're choosing, or that we're being invited into, is worlds that kind of help us bridge into that what appears to be something that is so completely separate or different from our real lives, but we're actually being invited in this very particular way, right, by it using things that are familiar to us, that we can recognize, that our bodies can respond to. So do you feel like, I mean, of course that makes sense, but do you think that the virtual reality world is helping us? Because a lot of people think that we're in a phase of, a giant shift of global consciousness, and that many people all over the world are waking up to, a new understanding and a new kind of self-awareness and a new understanding of what consciousness is. Do you think that this experience of gradually making our way into virtual reality worlds more and more is helping us wake up to what reality so-called actually is, or helping us gain more understanding of consciousness? Yeah.
I personally think it will help us to kind of wake up to find out what's really going on, because it gives us a model for how to think about something like higher dimensions, right? Because if you go back to the Vedas 5,000 years ago, they talked about the Leela, or the grand play, and the metaphors they used were of a play or a game. And also in the Buddhist traditions, they talk about dreams as the metaphor for reality. Going up to Shakespeare with his all the world's a stage and the men and women are merely players on it. And so those were the analogies that they used, because that was sort of what they had. If you go back to the 20th century, you had Yogananda, who wrote the famous autobiography of a yogi, and talk about reality is like a movie. It's like a film projector. You watch the things going on in the film, you can see people dying, but that's not the reality of what's going on. That's just what it looks like is going on. And so I believe, if Yogananda were alive today, he would say that life is more like an interactive video game. And so what happens is our ability to understand things is based a little bit on our ability to define metaphors, like Plato's idea of the cave, right? It was a metaphor that people could understand back then, that we were all locked inside a cave and not seeing the real world. We're seeing shadows on a wall of something like puppets, going by. And so that was a metaphor. So I do believe that as we create more detailed virtual realities that are closer to physical objects, right? I mean, just the fact that we spent so much time on Zoom over the last year, right, is already sucking us into the virtual world so that we feel like, oh, I just talked to so-and-so, but I didn't. It was actually just a virtual interaction that I just had with that person from my living room. And so, the more we do that, the more I think we get used to being in the virtual world. And so I do believe it'll lead us. I mean, the simulation hypothesis is the idea that if we can get to that point, maybe it's already happened and we're already inside the virtual reality. So there are even many atheists who say, well, the simulation hypothesis makes me reconsider my position because anyone outside the simulation would seem to us like a god or gods or programmers, which is sort of even Philip K. Dick. I think he was the first person to use that term. The programmer is like modifying things in our reality. So I think it gives us this ability to envision a broader perspective of what is reality. I mean, we're not quite there at matrix levels of virtual reality yet, but we probably will be there. I think within a number of decades. And so I think at that point, people will start to realize that, hey, this may be what's going on all along.
And then do you think the metaphorical red pill and blue pill will come into play at that point? And if so, what will they be? What will the red pill be and what will the blue pill be, do you think?
Well, that's a good question. Well, if we're, stuck inside our simulations all the time, then, it's a matter of just taking off the headset, right? But at that point, it would be beamed into us. But in terms of our physical reality, I personally, tend to agree with a lot of the mystical traditions that, we already have this ability to wake up and realize that this isn't the physical world around us. It's like that lucid dreaming idea, that to recognize that this is in fact a dream, that something is off. And that's what a lot of these glitches, so-called glitches in the matrix, as they're called now, whether it's synchronicity or deja vu or other, strange things like precognitive dreams, where you realize, oh, I saw this before. I saw it in a dream. Was the dream a rehearsal for what's actually happening now? So I think those things are the clues that can help wake us up. So I guess those would be the red pills, in a way. And I think the blue pill is just, saying, nope, there's nothing beyond this physical reality. So it's keeping the blinders on.
Okay, so you do think it's a choice then? Do you think it's a choice, or do you think that there's some kind of outside, higher, greater intelligence that's playing a game with us and we're an experiment? It kind of makes me think of Douglas Adams' book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. One of my favorite things about it is the fact that he introduces this idea that mice are actually highly evolved extraterrestrial beings, and they have been sent here, or they came here deliberately to study us. So we think that mice are pests, and we think that, we have to use them in labs, and we have control over them, and we can trap them, and we can kill them whenever we want to. We are dominant, they are powerless, when in the book, it's actually the other way around, right? That they are highly intelligent beings who think that we're not so bright, and they're studying us. So do you think that it's a choice to perceive one way or the other? Or do you think that there's this sort of higher intelligence or greater intelligence, or maybe a collective intelligence that is playing a game with us?
Well, this is an interesting question. It's a very deep question. I'm a big fan of the Hitchhiker's Guide books as well. But I think it goes back to my fundamental distinction between the NPC version and the RPG version of the simulation hypothesis. If we're an NPC version, then it is in fact a higher intelligence just sitting there watching the screen saying, okay, what are these crazy AIs going to do, right? In the RPG version, we exist outside of the simulation, right? So we are characters in the game, but we are the ones who are outside the simulation as well. So, one of the questions I ask people is, well, I get asked is, why would we set up a simulation? I said, well, why do you play video games? Right? Well, we do to have experiences that we can't have outside of the video game, right? I can't jump on a dragon and fly around and slay orcs and do all this cool stuff, or go on well, maybe some of us can go on ET spaceships, but it's a lot easier in a video game to do that. So we do it to have experiences that we can't have. And so within the RPG version, there's also this distinction that I like to make between the single player version and the multiplayer version. And the single player version is, closer to the philosophical idea of idealism, where there's no reality. The only thing I can be sure of, going back to Descartes, 500 years ago, is that I think, therefore I am, right? There could be an evil demon deceiving me and everything else is not real, but I know I'm real. But the MMORPG version is actually more interesting. So today when we play video games online, you can have millions of people logged on, right? In Fortnite, there were like 12 million people watching this one concert, right? Which was like a virtual concert. So it was 12 million avatars standing in this virtual space watching an actual singer sing, but the singer was then, his voice was actual, but portrayed as an avatar within the Fortnite world. So within an MMORPG, we are all making decisions individually about what's happening. And so that's why I like to make this distinction with a rendering device. We are all rendering reality on our own laptops or our own phones or our own X, whatever X happens to be in that case, because it depends what we are outside. So if we're just consciousness outside the simulation, then really it's being rendered onto that consciousness in some way. If there's a physical world outside of the simulation, then it's probably a more physical device. But I believe that we are all having a subjective experience, and somehow it's all being choreographed, just like with this call. It's all being choreographed to make it look like we're all in the same room or we're all talking to each other. But the reality is we're not, and there could be little differences of things that are happening along the way.
That's another aspect that also intrigues me, the idea of like how creativity and creation come into this, because there's so many different ways of talking about that. There's a common example that we talk about how we create our own reality, right? Like the way we wake up in the morning, the whatever we decide to think that day, or whatever attitude we decide to approach that day with, that's a large part of how we're going to determine how that day will unfold for us, right? So if we wake up in a miserable mood and we're cranky and we're terrible to people, most likely we're going to have a cranky, terrible day. But if we wake up and say, no, today's going to be a good day, and confront it that way, then you end up having a different day, right? So of course, everyone understands that idea. Attitude is everything. We create our own kind of experience, and then expanding that even more, we create our own reality. But I'm fascinated with the idea, and Grant and I have talked about this a lot as well. Is if this is a simulated reality, if this is not, if this is all an illusion, which I personally think that it is in some form, then is it just me? Am I the consciousness, and I'm creating all of this for myself? That somehow I am, you don't actually exist except in my mind, and Grant doesn't exist except in my mind? Or is this a collective experience where we're collectively creating together? And if so, how is that occurring? So, in virtual reality, just as you were just saying, people are choosing to come together in certain spaces and co-create not only whatever the virtual reality environment is, but co-create the experience of being in that reality. And it's just as holistic as it would be if it was, physical. So what can you say about that? What do you think of that idea? Is it one consciousness that is creating everything and perceiving everything, or do you think it's collective? What's your perspective on that?
Well, my perspective is that's closer to the MMORPG, so the massively multiplayer online role-playing game, which is that in fact we have multiple consciousness, and we are all playing the game together. But if you think of it in terms of a video game, I might choose a character, or let's go back to the days before video games. I used to play Dungeons and Dragons, back in the 80s, and you have a character sheet and you say, I'm going to be a barbarian and I'm going to have a lot of strength, but not so much intelligence. And I'm going to have, somebody else is really stealthy and they have a lot of charisma. Well, it turns out we all have different attributes on our avatars within this game, right? We can choose to develop certain ones, I think, better than others, but I feel like we all come in with a set of attributes and a set of tasks and quests, which are things that we are meant to do. And so I think of that as our storyline. And so within video games, we always have quests and achievements as a way of breaking down, what that character should be working on next. And so, that's how you make progress and you level up in the game, is you achieve a particular quest and then you go on to the next quest, which might be more difficult as well. So I believe a part of when we talk about creating our own reality, that part of it we've already mapped out for ourselves a broad storyline. Who's to say that Grant was going to be researching paranormal phenomenon when he was a baby, right? Or that I was going to be interested in simulation and its overlap with religion. But I believe that we all have things that draw us, and it's partly built into our character storyline, and we can always make our choices to not follow a particular path or not go with a particular person. I believe it's related to the idea of karma, where karma can be thought of, within the Hindu and Buddhist traditions. There's actually two slight variations. Within the Hindu tradition, there's an indestructible soul that goes back and inhabits each body. Now, of course, you don't have to make much of an analogy with video games. You go in, you have a body, you download the information, and at the end of the life, you upload the information. Where does it go? To some cloud server is what I like to call it. And in Buddhism, there's not necessarily a soul, but rather a bag of karma, which, what is that? That's just information, right? So now we're back to information. It's just something in a database somewhere that we can keep track of. And by when we change our thoughts, or as you said, create a reality or act idiotic towards people or mean towards people, I feel like it adds little tasks into the database that says, okay, this is stuff that we're going to have to deal with. And so, it may not be always that easy to change things because we have a whole bunch of this stuff from the past that we still have to figure, we still have to do. And so we have to get our list of tasks and achievements down. So, that tends to be, my understanding. Now, beyond that, there's probably a sense of a single consciousness beyond that level of consciousness. So now we're getting into nested simulations. And where does it end? Probably it ends with a single consciousness that decided, for the same reason that we decide to create video games or movies, it's to have certain experiences by breaking out into different individual units who then decide to go in and have experiences with each other and play different roles, within it. So that's sort of my thinking on the subject within the simulation.
Oh, fascinating. Fascinating. I don't want to hog the conversation anymore. I'm just so curious, but Grant, please take it away.
I've got an important question here. You were talking about the cloud. You were talking about the Eastern religions. We always sort of assumed that the Eastern religions were kind of stupid because they couldn't build a cell phone. And then we now suddenly discover that they probably had it all figured out. They were talking about this stuff like 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. I'm very interested in your cloud analogy, the idea of information. Let me give you a couple of examples here. You mentioned Diane Pasulka. If you've read the book, you'll know there's this Tyler D guy. I actually met the guy. And he said to me, he had this invention that he sold, I think, for $100 million on NASDAQ, the company. He said to me, Grant, the morning I woke up with that idea in my head, the last thing I remember the night before was a hooded figure standing at the end of the bed. And he talks about this modality that he uses. He gets a glass of water, he sleeps for 8 hours, he gets up, he goes back to bed for an hour, he sits in the sun, he goes through that whole modality. And another example would be Larry Page. When he gave his commencement speech at Michigan, he's talking about how Google started. He said, some people have dreams. I had one of those dreams. And he starts telling about this dream in the middle of the night to download the internet and just keep the links. And then there's a guy by the name of George Flynn. So they asked George Flynn, he's an autistic savant, which are very interesting people. They said, George, what's 2 + 3? And he said, would that be 7? And they said, no, it's not 7. And then they say, so what day is July the 11th, 93,430? And he says, well, that's a Tuesday. And the question starts to be is there a cloud? Because 40% of all experiencers, I know in near-death experiences, there's the same sort of thing that a lot of people in near-death experiences in the UFO community, experiencers will say, 40% of them will say, at one point during my experience, I knew the answer to everything in the universe. And when they came back, it was all gone. Now you'd say, well, if you're going to make up a story, that's not what you're going to make up. And you talked about this, what I call contact modalities. You talked about drumming. Can you talk about your personal experience in terms of being able to sort of get in the field? Do you think this is possible where you can sort of tap in the field through different modalities and pick up stuff like Larry Page did, or even the Stanford University? Stanford University is actually called the Leland Stanford Junior University, and it was started because Leland Stanford had a dream where his kid died at 15 years old and came back and told him he had to do something for the kids in California. That's where Stanford University comes from. And they don't want to tell that story because it's so really bizarre, or the fact that his brother was doing seances in Australia and donated 135,000 pounds to Stanford University in 1915 for parapsychology research. And of course, because parapsychology is all nonsense, the psychology department took it. So there's all these examples. And I remember you talking about the drumming. So can you talk about your personal experience in terms of being able to sort of zone out, or is there a field of information where you can download stuff and the information is there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I didn't know that story about Stanford. I mean, I went to business school at Stanford, and they talk about Leland Stanford's son dying, and that's why they decided to establish a university. But I didn't know about the dream part, so that's quite intriguing. Yeah. So there was when I was at MIT, we were at the Media Lab, and I actually was having people try different, relaxation techniques, and we actually did some shamanic drumming, some shamanic journeying, within the Media Lab as a way for people to get access, to higher creativity. And so I've experimented with a lot of different techniques, whether it's just straight meditation or shamanic journeying, which I think of as kind of, you started off as a guided meditation and it takes on a life of its own, right? And so it's a way of using the imagination. But yeah, I do believe that by getting ourselves into alignment with rhythmic breathing, and that's what really the drumming does, right? It's a certain beat, and so it allows your whole body and your breathing to slow down and get into a certain rhythm that we can kind of remember or see past all the stuff that's going on, around us. It's almost as if all the stuff in our lives. There's a gentleman named Tom Campbell, who wrote a book called My Big Toe, My Big Theory of Everything. And he's a big advocate of simulation theory, going back many years now. And he was also at the Monroe Institute years ago. And he talks about, well, if the world is just a stream of data that's coming in, right? And so if you think about it, if all the information around me is a stream of data, and I start to just treat that data really seriously, I'm forgetting about all the other data that's out there. So, by slowing down, you're almost like taking off the headset a little bit, right? You're kind of lifting it up a little bit. And of course, most of us, I think, can, only access it in a sporadic way, like Tyler D seems to have a methodology, for doing that. But in the Chinese traditions, there's this idea of the goddess of forgetfulness, Meng Po, and she brews the tea of forgetfulness, and we take it, when we're born and then after we die, so that we forget about things. And in the Greek traditions, we cross Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, and so we forget about all that stuff that was already there. And so, it's fascinating to me that the Greeks had this idea that all of this information was already available to us, and that we tap into it. And so, I like to think of it kind of like guides in a game. You have super users and guild leaders who are like doling out tasks to people. And so maybe this hooded figure is like Tyler D's, kind of a TA, if you will, in whatever higher university in the sky, who is sending the information and saying, okay, this is your next task. This is your next task, right? This is the thing that you need to work on next. And, I often feel that way with my books or with my companies or projects where, okay, it's like, well, I guess it's time that I got to do this because this is the project that was assigned to me. And so some of it might come through relaxation, drumming, visualization, but other times it just crops up through synchronicity in the world. And usually, for example, I mentioned Yogananda earlier, who wrote Autobiography of a Yogi. I'm actually writing a book for HarperCollins India about what I learned from Autobiography of a Yogi. And one day, HarperCollins in India just emailed me and say, hey, we'd like you to write this book. I said, well, that's interesting. How did you end up with me? It was almost like the universe is saying, whoop, this task was assigned to you. And it wasn't like a logical thing. It's not like I've written books on Yogananda before. It was just, you're the right guy, so we want you to do it. So it was,
that's definitely very interesting. I mean, I think Grant would probably second this. I'm sure that we've done so many interviews. I've been assisting him for just over a year now, a year and a few months. We've done a ton of interviews, and one of the consistent threads, regardless of the context of that person's story or their background or whatever it is that they're talking about, is this feeling that, there's a shared experience underneath all of this, and that we can tap into it, right, in different ways, but that we have to be able to follow the signs, the messages, instincts, whatever it is. So if you do that, this is what I hear again and again, and I've experienced this myself as well, that if you do that, if you listen, you pay attention, you follow these things, even if it seems bananas or seems, just like Neo was doing in the Matrix, right? He followed the white rabbit, didn't know why, didn't know where he was going, but he did it. And that's what led him further down the rabbit hole, so-called, into the truth of what was actually going on. And, I hear that again and again, that people say that if they follow so-called the white rabbit, let's just call it that, they're able to go further and further into the truth of what it is that they're trying to uncover, even if they don't exactly know what it is, because it's as if the universe is saying, oh, would you like some more? here's a little more. Here's another breadcrumb. Here's another breadcrumb, right? So that's what your story just now made me think of, that the universe is kind of saying, oh, you'd like some more? Here's a book, write this book. You know, you can put your information out a little further and share it with more people and, you know, journey further into your own thinking about it. So it's really amazing how this continues to unfold. You know, we just have to have some curiosity and some open-mindedness and some willingness, and it kind of lands in our lap sometimes, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. And, you know, I like to call those clues on our personal treasure hunt, right? And the idea is like with an Indiana Jones movie, like Raiders of the Lost Ark, he doesn't just get the Ark right at the beginning of the movie. He has to follow one clue, and where does it lead to the next clue? And where does that lead to the next clue? And, you know, and I think this relates to the idea of simulation in an interesting way, particularly, you know, my new book, Simulated Multiverse, is about this idea that there are actually multiple possible futures. And so it's possible that, you know, we've gone down this road before, and now we're told, don't go that way, go that way, right? This will lead to a better outcome. And
like a choose your own adventure book or something. Like
exactly, just like a choose your own adventure book, right? That there are these pathways that have been laid out for us, just like in a choose your own adventure book, and we can go down one and then realize it's not the right one, and we can come back, and then we can go again, just like Philip K. Dick saying, you know, Germany and Japan winning World War II is not such a good idea. Maybe it doesn't lead us to the right place. And then you rewind that you can do that on a personal level as well. You know, in fact, he believed he communicated with some beings that said they tried to prevent the JFK assassination in Dallas, but then he would get assassinated in another city like Orlando or another city. And each time it would lead to a worse outcome than the one that we have. And therefore they decided to just rewind and let it proceed. And I think that, you know, that's how, you know, quantum computers work. That's how AI training works, right? For cars, and when AI plays video games like Go and chess, you know, AI got to the point where they could beat a professional player of the game Go, which has been really difficult to do. And the way that the game learns is it plays itself like a million times, and it just learns the best strategies. And so I believe these clues could be signals that we're playing the game forward, and we're then trying different things and then picking the one, you know, so the clues are in a way a message from a possible future self, right? Which ties to the whole idea of quantum physics, which says that, you know, there may be these other different universes and possibilities, and that one of them, we only see one of them at a time, but the others exist, and they're sending us information back, you know? So I think, yeah, we do have these clues, these breadcrumbs, as you call them, and as we follow them, then the universe leads us to whatever it is that we wanted to experience as part of our storyline.
Yeah, I mean, earlier when you were saying, we have to wrap up, unfortunately, but earlier when you were talking about how virtual reality is helping us, and I say helping us blur the line, not blurring the line, because usually when you say a line is blurred, it's almost a detrimental thing. It's not such a good thing, but in this case, it feels like it's a helpful thing, you know, that we're learning to expand our perception and not be so attached to the physicality of what's around us. And when you said that the line is being blurred between what's real and what isn't, I felt like in that moment when you said that, I had this feeling of, you know, a door is being knocked on, right? That this is like a knock on the door to us, to open the door, to reveal something new, to go a little further into something else that again, even if we don't know what it is, right? We don't know where we're going or what we're doing. Just like Neo in The White Rabbit, you still want to kind of follow it because there's something in you, maybe some ancient part of all of us, you know, maybe the part of us that's always connected to what people call source, the part of us that knows all, right? This is what some people say, that there's a part of all of us that knows all, that maybe it's that part of us, you know, that's saying, come a little further, come and get to know yourself again, go a little further down this road so that you can become more familiar with, you know, what our true nature really is. There's so many fun possibilities to explore and so many wonderful things to contemplate. So as we wrap up now, unfortunately, because this has been a wonderful conversation, what is something that you would like to leave our audience with, you know, with all the work that you're doing and all the amazing different pathways, all the choose your own adventures that you can go down with the work that you're doing? What is something that you feel is really key, really core, that you'd like to inspire our audience with by leaving it with them as a kind of golden nugget at the end of this conversation? No pressure.
Sure. Well, one of the things that jumping into simulation theory has helped me think about is that, you know, we all go through difficulties in our lives, right? And sometimes people say, well, of course, this isn't a simulated game, because if I were to make a game, I would make myself a billionaire and I would have all of these things and everything would be so great. But if you remember in the Matrix movies, in the second one or the third one, they revealed the first version of the Matrix was a blissful environment, and humans didn't accept it as real because there was no conflict, there was no struggle. And so, I guess the thing that I'd want to leave the audience with is that a video game is boring if there aren't any challenges or any struggles. And so the challenges are placed before you that your character is ready to accept. And part of leveling up really is dealing with those challenges. And so I think that gives us a better perspective to deal with some of the challenges we might have in life.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Grant, what about you?
I'm very honored to have done the interview, and I think you're leading the way in terms of changing consciousness, and I'm very optimistic after I hear you speak that it makes a lot of sense, and you see a lot of strife in the world, and you pointed out that may be part of what we've chosen to do. So I just acknowledge your work, and we'll continue to promote your ideas as much as possible. And thank you for what you do.
Well, thank you very much for that. And thanks for having me on the podcast. This was a lot of fun.
It was great. It was great. And maybe it will happen again. Who knows? It feels like there's a to be continued somewhere in here. So thank you so much, Rizwan, for being here. Grant, thank you as always for letting me be here. And it's been such a pleasure. So good night, everybody. Good night. Oh.